Good evening, and welcome back to Classified Conflict. Wherever you are right now, settled in, comfortable, the day finally behind you, I'm glad you're here. Tonight, we're going to slow things down and let the world outside go quiet for a while. We're going back to a time when the outcome of the Second World War was still being decided in workshops and committee rooms and muddy fields, and where something as deceptively simple as a rifle, a piece of steel and walnut, carried consequences that almost nobody fully grasped in the moment. Not until later, when the dust settled and the survivors had time to understand what had actually happened to them out there on those fields and beaches and forest roads. Tonight, we're talking about the M1 Garand, a rifle that most people outside of military history circles couldn't pick out of a lineup. Not flashy, not dramatic, just a long, heavy, serious-looking tool. And yet, soldiers who faced it on the other side of the line described it with a kind of wary respect that shaded towards something closer to fear. German veterans would describe the moment an American infantry squad opened fire and try to understand, genuinely, how one country could afford to give every ordinary foot soldier something that sounded like a machine gun. That question had an answer. Tonight, we're going to find it. This is the story of the rifle, the man who built it, the country that produced it by the millions, and the soldiers on both sides who lived with its consequences. Take a slow breath, let your body settle wherever you are, and let's go back together. And before we get too far in, if these slow, deep journeys through history are something you look forward to, it would mean a great deal if you'd like this video and subscribe to the channel. It helps more people find their way here. Now, let's begin. On January 1st, 1888, a boy was born just outside Montreal in a small Quebec farming community called Saint-Rémy. The family name was Garand. The boy's full name, in the French tradition of that region, was Jean Cantius Garand. He would later go by John, which was a simpler fit for the English-speaking world he was moving toward. He was one of 12 children, 6 boys and 6 girls, raised on a modest farm where ingenuity and hard work were not optional. They were survival requirements. The boys all shared the formal first name, Saint-Jean-le-Baptiste, which in practice meant they went by their middle names to avoid confusion. John was the exception. He insisted on going by John, and that quiet stubbornness, persistent, calm, unlikely to bend, would define much of what he later built. The family's circumstances changed permanently when John was 11. His mother died, and his father, unable to manage a large farm and 12 children on his own, moved the family to Jewett City, Connecticut. It was a mill town, small, industrial, practical, and it turned out to be exactly the right environment for a boy whose mind worked the way John Garand's did. He became a bobbin boy in a textile mill at age 12, tending the looms, watching the machines, learning the mechanics of how things moved. Where another child might have found it tedious, Garand found it instructive. He learned forging, welding, and steam engineering in that factory. He absorbed the logic of mechanical systems and began to see, almost instinctively, where they could be improved. Before he turned 18, he had already filed patents on 2 of his own inventions, a telescopic screwjack and an automatic bobbin winding machine. These were not the experiments of a hobbyist. They were the work of someone who had already developed a particular way of looking at the world, always searching for the flaw in the existing design, always asking whether there was a more efficient answer. He would spend the rest of his life asking that question. As you breathe slowly and let your body settle into wherever you're resting tonight, consider how often the most consequential things in history trace back to something ordinary and personal. A family that moved to a mill town. A boy who found factory work interesting rather than grinding. John Garand did not grow up thinking about weapons or warfare. He grew up thinking about mechanisms, about the satisfaction of a system that operates exactly as it should. It was only circumstance that made that mechanism a rifle. In his 20s, he moved through several tool-making firms and eventually found work with Brown and Sharp in Providence, Rhode Island, one of the most respected precision manufacturing companies in the country at that time. He also learned to shoot, practicing at galleries along Broadway in New York. The combination of precision engineering and firearms accuracy was, it turned out, exactly what history was about to require. In 1916, working in New York, Garand began designing his first semi-automatic rifle on his own initiative. No contract, no prize, no request from anyone. He had simply decided it was a problem worth solving. In 1917, when the United States entered the First World War and the Army solicited designs for a light machine gun, Garand submitted his work. The War Department selected it. His work then attracted broader attention from the government, and in 1919 he was offered a position at the Bureau of Standards in Washington. A year and a half later, he was transferred to the government's Springfield Armory in Massachusetts, where he became a naturalized United States citizen in 1920. And there, in a decision that most private inventors would have considered impossible, he transferred all rights to his inventions to the US government. No royalties, no percentage, nothing beyond his government salary of $3,500 a year. Every rifle that would eventually carry his name, and there would eventually be more than 6.5 million of them, would make him nothing in personal income. He understood exactly what he was giving away. He did it anyway. Let the quiet settle around you for a moment. The sounds of the house, the night outside. Let them fade to the background. We're in 1919 and Springfield Armory is a serious, purposeful place. Engineers and ordnance men walk its corridors. A modest Canadian-American with thick-rimmed glasses and the disposition of an absorbed technician has just been handed an assignment that will occupy the next 17 years of his working life. The assignment was to design a semi-automatic service rifle. That sounds simple enough. It was not. The Army had firm requirements. The rifle should share as many parts as possible with the existing M1903 Springfield bolt action that American soldiers had carried through the trenches of France. It should fire the .30-06 Springfield cartridge, of which enormous stockpiles remained from the war, and it should suit not just the infantrymen but the cavalrymen and the tank crew as well. Beyond all of that, it needed to be manufacturable at scale by semi-skilled labor in wartime conditions, the requirement that most competing designers treated as secondary, and that Garand treated as the most important consideration of all. He started with a primer-actuated mechanism, an elegant idea that used the tiny rearward movement of a cartridge primer after firing to cycle the action. It worked in controlled testing, but it was sensitive to variations in ammunition, and American military cartridges were not manufactured to tolerances precise enough to make the system reliable across millions of rounds under field conditions. So he abandoned it and switched to a gas-operated design, where a small volume of expanding propellant gas was captured near the muzzle and used to drive a piston rearward, operating the bolt. That system worked, not without problems at first, but it was fundamentally robust, and robustness was what he was after. Through the 1920s and into the early 1930s, Garand refined prototype after prototype, competing against designs by engineers Pedersen, Thompson, and others, cycling through trials at Fort Benning and inconclusive reports and boards that convened and reconvened. At one point, testing had produced a clear winner in .276 caliber, Garand's own T3E2 design in a smaller cartridge, which was actually performing well. But on February 25, 1932, Army Chief of Staff General Douglas MacArthur personally intervened and cancelled all work on .276 caliber rifles entirely. The Army had warehouses full of .30-06 ammunition, and that was that. More redesign, more years. Garand went back to his workbench without complaint. On August 3, 1933, the design was formally designated the semi-automatic rifle, caliber 30 M1. Field trials ran in 1934, 50 rifles to infantry units, 25 to cavalry. There were problems, more modifications, and then on January 9, 1936, the United States Army officially adopted it as the U.S. rifle, caliber .30 M1, the Garand. After 17 years of work, it had a name. Pause here for a moment and consider what that adoption meant in 1936. Japan had invaded Manchuria in 1931. Hitler had come to power in Germany in 1933. Italy had invaded Ethiopia in 1935. The machinery of a Second World War was already in motion, even as most of America remained unwilling to see it clearly. And the United States had just adopted the only semi-automatic rifle in the world that was genuinely ready to serve as the standard-issue weapon of an entire army. Every other major military power was still issuing bolt-action rifles as the primary infantry arm. The British carried the Lee Enfield. The Germans carried the Karabiner 98K. The Soviets used the Mosin Nagant. The Japanese relied on the Type 38, and later the Type 99 Arisaka. All bolt-action rifles, capable, some of them excellent, a few of them genuinely refined pieces of engineering, but all requiring the same sequence of manual effort between every shot. To fire a bolt action, a soldier shoots, then reaches up with the right hand, grasps the bolt handle, twists it up to unlock, pulls it rearward to eject the spent case, pushes it forward to chamber a new round, and twists it back down to lock, and only then is the rifle ready to fire again. The British Lee Enfield was considered among the fastest bolt-action designs ever built. A highly skilled soldier, drilling intensively in what was called the Mad Minute, could manage roughly 15 aimed shots per minute. The M1 Garand fired as fast as a soldier could pull the trigger. 8 rounds, no manual cycling between shots, with an aimed rate of fire of 40 to 50 rounds per minute in trained hands. A rifleman with a Garand could put out more than 3 times the volume of accurate fire of his German counterpart with a K9 8K per man, at every engagement, on every front. As you drift a little deeper into the story tonight, let that number settle. 3 times the firepower, per man, for every American infantryman who stepped ashore on any beach, any island, any field in Europe or the Pacific. The M1 was fed by what John Garand called an Bloc clip, a metal device holding 8 rounds of .30-06 ammunition that loaded directly into the rifle's fixed internal magazine. Press the clip in with the thumb, the bolt slams forward on its own and chambers the first round. The rifle is ready. When all 8 rounds are fired, the clip ejects automatically from the top of the receiver and the bolt locks back open, signaling the shooter to reload. A practiced soldier could insert a fresh clip and have the rifle back in action in roughly 2 seconds. The .30-06 Springfield cartridge the Garand fired was itself a serious round. A 150-grain bullet leaving the muzzle at approximately 2,700 feet per second, generating around 2,400 foot-pounds of energy at the muzzle, with an effective combat range of 500 yards for the average rifleman. The rifle's sights were calibrated to 1,200 yards. The cartridge could penetrate light cover and still carry lethal energy. It was powerful in a way that the smaller intermediate cartridges introduced by later generations of assault rifles were specifically engineered not to be. The rifle weighed about 9.5 pounds unloaded, heavy, with no polite way to say otherwise. A soldier carrying it for 8 hours through mud or forest or sand knew it was there, but the 24-inch barrel, rigidly supported, gave it the accuracy that justified the weight. Production began in September 1937, when Springfield Armory started delivering 10 rifles per day. 10. For an army that would eventually need millions of them. By September 1939, when Germany invaded Poland and the war in Europe began, output had reached 100 per day, still far below what would be required. The army pushed hard to expand, retool, and hire. By January 1941, 600 M1 Garands were leaving Springfield daily. At the peak of the war effort, that number climbed to 4,000 per day from that single facility alone. The cost curve dropped sharply as production scaled. Early production cost approximately $200 per rifle. By 1945, that figure had fallen to $26. But there is more to that story. Winchester Repeating Arms also began producing M1 Garands in January 1941, starting from serial number 100,101. Combined, Springfield and Winchester produced more than 4 million M1 rifles during the war years. When post-war production is included, the total across all manufacturers exceeded 6.5 million rifles. By 1944, nearly half the workforce at Springfield Armory was women. They were formerly known as the Women Ordnance Workers, the WOWs, and they were not performing secondary tasks. They ran the heavy forges, operated the lathes, did the precision inletting on the walnut stocks, and were responsible for every stage of production. When the men went to the front, the women ran the factory. The rifles they built were carried across Normandy, through the Hurtgen forest, and up the beaches of Okinawa and Iwo Jima. Their contribution never appears in the battle histories, but it was present on every one of those fields. Let your breathing slow a little. Outside, the night is quiet. We're still in the early 1940s, watching a country building something enormous at speed. Meanwhile, in Germany, a different set of decisions had already been made. The German military adopted the Karabiner 98K as its standard infantry rifle in 1935. The K98K descended from a Mauser design that had been refined over decades. By most assessments, it was the finest bolt-action rifle ever produced. Accurate, rugged, reliable in the mud of the Eastern Front and the sand of North Africa and the cold of a Belgian winter. The action was smooth, the trigger clean, and German soldiers were trained to use it effectively. In the hands of a skilled rifleman, the K98K was a capable and dangerous weapon. But it was a bolt-action rifle, and German military doctrine had organized itself around that constraint. The Wehrmacht built its infantry squads around firepower from the machine gun, not the individual rifle. Every German infantry squad, typically 10 men, centered on a general-purpose machine gun, first the MG-34 and then the MG-42. The rifleman existed primarily to support the machine gun, to protect it, carry its ammunition, and suppress enemy movement so it could reposition and fire. The machine gun was the source of the squad's offensive power. The rifles were secondary. That doctrine made sense given the weapons available. You cannot outshoot a general-purpose machine gun with a bolt-action rifle, so you organize your tactics around the machine gun and accept what the rifle can and cannot do. The problem Germany would encounter, progressively and then acutely, was that this entire calculation changed when the opposing infantry carried semi-automatic rifles. When American soldiers first encountered German troops, in the Philippines after Pearl Harbor, then in North Africa, then in Sicily and Italy and ultimately France, the Germans on the receiving end of American rifle fire noticed something that didn't fit their expectations. American rifle fire came not in the steady crack, crack, crack of trained bolt-action riflemen working smoothly through the reload cycle, but in something faster and more continuous, something that sounded from across a hedgerow or a stone wall, like every individual American infantryman was carrying a light machine gun. Reports from the Pacific Theater describe Japanese soldiers who first encountered Garand-armed American infantry reaching a similar conclusion, that the Americans must be equipping their foot soldiers with machine guns because no individual rifle could sustain that rate of fire. The reality, that it was each man's personal weapon, was genuinely outside the frame of what they had been trained to expect. German soldiers arrived at the same assessment somewhat faster because they understood firearms mechanics well, but the operational shock was comparable. Captured American rifles were examined carefully. German ordnance officers filed reports. The message that moved through the Wehrmacht was consistent. American infantry had a capability at the individual level that German infantry did not. Rest here for a breath. Let the night stay quiet around you. The mathematics of this matter and are worth understanding clearly. When two opposing forces engage with rifles, the side that can deliver more accurate fire in a given period of time holds an advantage that goes beyond simple casualty counts. Men who are suppressed, who must keep their heads down because rounds are landing near them continuously, cannot return effective aimed fire, cannot maneuver, and cannot coordinate. They are, for the duration of that suppression, functionally removed from the engagement. The M1 Garand, in the hands of a 10-man American infantry squad, could deliver roughly 8 times the volume of accurate aimed fire that a comparable German squad could produce with K98K rifles. 8 times the fire from the same number of men. Even accounting for the MG-42, which fired at an extraordinary rate and was a genuinely fearsome weapon, the individual rifle equation had shifted so far in the Americans' favor that it changed the character of close-quarters combat in fundamental ways. At Hill 609 in Tunisia in early 1943, an American patrol and a German patrol came around the same ridge at roughly the same moment and found each other at a distance of about 20 yards. At that range, with bolt-action rifles, the outcome of a meeting engagement depends almost entirely on who fires first. With semi-automatic rifles on one side, the equation is different. The German unit was wiped out. The American patrol walked away. That is a single incident, and no single incident explains a war. But it illustrates at the smallest possible scale what the firepower difference actually looked like in practice, not in strategic calculations or production charts, but in 30 seconds of contact in the dust of North Africa, where the rifle in your hands was either fast enough or it wasn't. Germany was not passive in response to the problem. Before the war began, the Wehrmacht had already solicited semi-automatic rifle designs from Mauser and Walter, the Gewehr 41M and the Gewehr 41W, respectively. Both were gas-operated semi-automatics, and both were in field use, significant disappointments. The gas system both designs used, a type named after its Danish inventor Bang, captured propellant gas at the muzzle rather than from a port drilled into the barrel, because German ordnance specifications at the time prohibited barrel ports on the theory that they might cause premature wear or pressure problems. The result was a mechanism that was heavy, complicated, and prone to fouling under the conditions that combat actually produces. They were built in limited numbers, and they did not solve the problem. The clearest look Germany got at what a well-designed semi-automatic service rifle could do came on the Eastern Front beginning in 1941, when Soviet soldiers were encountered carrying the SVT-40, a gas-operated Tokarev semi-automatic chambered in 7.62 by 54 mm R. The SVT-40 had reliability issues, particularly when poorly maintained, but its gas mechanism was genuinely elegant. Captured examples were shipped back to Germany for evaluation. Engineers at Walter studied them. In 1943, they produced a new design that combined elements of the G41W with a simplified gas system adapted directly from the captured Soviet rifle. That was the Gewehr 43, and it was a meaningfully better weapon than anything Germany had previously issued. The G43 held 10 rounds in a detachable box magazine, was gas-operated, acceptably reliable in field conditions, and accurate at ranges comparable to the K98K. Snipers found it particularly useful. Approximately 10% of all G43s were fitted with a 4-power telescopic sight and issued to designated marksmen. But the G43 was not, in any operationally meaningful sense, the answer Germany needed. Total production across the Gewehr 43's entire manufacturing run, from October 1943 through the end of the war in May 1945, was approximately 402,000 rifles. In that same period, The United States was producing M1 Garands at a rate that made that number look negligible. For every single Gewehr 43 Germany produced, America produced more than 50 M1 Garands. The G43 was never general issue. The standard allocation was roughly 1 per platoon, with 2 of those designated as sniper rifles held away from frontline action. The ordinary German infantryman went through the entire war with a K98K bolt action as his primary weapon. There are accounts of German soldiers who, when they had the opportunity, would trade their G43 for a captured M1 Garand against regulations because the American rifle was more reliable, more robust, easier to maintain, and faster to reload. Some carried captured Garands for as long as they could find compatible ammunition. As the night grows a little deeper and quieter around you, consider what it must have been like to be on the receiving end of something you could not quite account for. Combat, for the individual soldier, is almost always fragmented and disorienting. Fast and then slow, deafeningly loud and then eerily silent, a constant process of trying to orient yourself when nothing is fixed. You know roughly where fire is coming from. You know what your training says to do. But the fuller picture of why the other side is behaving in a way you didn't expect is often assembled only later, if at all. For German infantrymen fighting Americans in the hedgerows of Normandy in the summer of 1944, or in the Ardennes during the Battle of the Bulge that December, engaging an American rifle squad produced a specific and consistent experience. The volume of fire didn't pause in the way they were accustomed to. The moments of opportunity that opened between an enemy rifleman's shots, moments that existed reliably with bolt-action opponents, didn't open the same way. The suppression was harder to break because the moment a head came up, another round was already coming. General George Patton, not a man given to sentiment, and someone who had seen what artillery and tanks and air power could do, called the M1 Garand the greatest battle implement ever devised. That assessment, coming from someone with his frame of reference, carries particular weight. His highest praise went not to the Sherman tank, not to the B-17, not to the artillery that cleared roads and shattered fortifications. It went to a rifle. There is a story attached to the M1 Garand that has circulated in veterans' accounts, history books, and firearms discussions for decades. It is the story of the ping. When the M1's on-block clip was ejected after the final round was fired, it left the receiver with a sharp, distinctive metallic sound, a ping, as it struck the rear of the receiver on its way out. The clip's ejection was automatic and audible, and the question of whether the enemy could use that sound as a tactical signal became one of the more debated minor legends of the Second World War. The legend holds that German soldiers learned to wait for the ping, recognizing it as the moment an American rifleman had exhausted his clip and faced 2 seconds of vulnerability during reload. Some American veterans affirm this, describing German soldiers charging toward the sound. But here is what the German veterans themselves said on the matter. An M1 Garand armorer who interviewed former German soldiers and panzer commanders on this question summarized their response this way: "We're getting shot at. Our hearing already isn't that great. We didn't listen for that ping." Multiple German veterans gave substantially the same answer. The honest assessment is that in a true firefight, with artillery landing, machine guns firing, grenades detonating, men shouting across the noise, the sound of a single rifle clip ejecting would be impossible to isolate and act upon usefully. Former combat soldiers on both sides consistently described the battlefield as deafening. What is documented, though, is what some American G's started doing when they heard the story about the ping. They began carrying an empty on-block clip in a pocket, firing off a round or two, then throwing the empty clip against a rock or a hard surface to produce the sound deliberately, and waiting to see if a German head came up before shooting. The rumor about a weakness in their own weapon had become a tool. That response says something specific about American soldiers and also something specific about their confidence in the rifle they were carrying. Let your breathing settle. There is no hurry here. John Garand himself spent the war years not in combat but at Springfield Armory, which was where his skills were most needed. He worked to refine production processes and developed the tooling and gauges that made it possible for semi-skilled workers, many of them women who had never worked in a factory before the war, to manufacture precision firearms to tolerances that would have been considered unreachable a decade earlier. He was not a public figure. A newspaper account from 1941 described him as being of average build and average appearance, with what the reporter called the quiet shyness of the absorbed technician. He could move through a crowd unrecognized. In 1941, he was awarded the Meritorious Civilian Service Award. In 1944, he received the Medal for Merit, one of the first civilians to receive what was then a new decoration. When the war ended, Congress considered a bill to award Garand $100,000 in recognition of his contribution, roughly equivalent to the royalties he had signed away when he transferred his patents to the government. The bill did not pass. John Garand, who had watched more than 6 million rifles built from his design and had earned nothing from any of them beyond his government salary, received nothing more. He kept working regardless. When he retired from Springfield Armory in 1953, he was still actively designing, working on a bullpup rifle concept that fired the same .30-06 cartridge as the M1, but with an entirely different layout and mechanism. The project was cancelled when he retired. The prototype was sent to the Springfield Armory Museum. John Garand died on February 16, 1974. He was 86 years old. In 1973, a year before his death, he was inducted into the U.S. Army Ordnance Corps Hall of Fame. The citation credited him, in the measured language of military institutions, with giving the U.S. soldier a firepower advantage during World War II by means of his initiative and inventive genius. It was a dry way to put it. But the practical meaning of that firepower advantage, on 100,000 fields and beaches and crossroads across 2 oceans, was anything but dry. As you breathe and the story settles around you, let's move through the actual theaters where the Garand was doing the work it was designed to do. The rifle arrived in the Philippines in late 1941, mixed in among the older M1903 Springfield bolt-action rifles that were still being phased out. When Japan attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, American soldiers in the Philippines were mid-transition to the new rifle, which created a supply problem immediately. Ordnance men who hadn't been fully briefed sent 5-round stripper clips compatible with the M1903, not the N-block clips the Garand required. Soldiers with new semi-automatic rifles had to find their ejected clips in the debris and reload them by hand, under fire. Not the operational debut anyone had planned, but the rifle itself, the basic gas-operated mechanism that Garand had spent 17 years perfecting, functioned. Even when the logistics around it failed, the rifle worked. The M1 arrived at Guadalcanal in August 1942, when the 1st Marine Division landed on that steaming island in the Solomon Chain and began one of the most costly campaigns of the Pacific War. The Marine Corps had been slow to adopt the Garand, partly because Marine culture placed exceptional emphasis on disciplined marksmanship, and some senior officers were skeptical that a semi-automatic platform would encourage the shot discipline they demanded. But in jungle combat, where ranges were short and contact was sudden and close, the ability to fire 8 rounds without manual cycling was not a theoretical advantage. It was the difference between surviving the first seconds of contact and not. By the time Marines were clearing tunnels and bunkers on Iwo Jima in the spring of 1945, the Garand had become as standard and as essential as the uniform itself. Far to the west, in the European theater, the Allied landings in North Africa in late 1942 brought American soldiers into direct contact with German troops for the first time. The early results were difficult. American units were often inexperienced, commanders were sometimes overconfident, and they were up against a German army that had been fighting effectively for 3 years. At Kasserine Pass in February 1943, American forces suffered a significant tactical defeat. But even in those early months, the individual rifle advantage was noted by tacticians on both sides, and the study of how to use that advantage effectively would shape American small unit doctrine for the remainder of the war. By the campaign across Tunisia later in 1943, American infantry squads had worked out their tactics more clearly. The Garand's rate of fire allowed rifle squads to fix an enemy position, to keep heads down, prevent movement, deny the enemy the ability to reposition, while other elements maneuvered to flank it. That is the core of fire and movement, and it depends on the ability to generate sustained suppressive fire. One 10-man American squad could generate that suppression against a comparable German squad armed with bolt-action rifles without needing to commit a machine gun to do it. That freed up the squad's heavier weapons for other tasks. And then there was Italy, the campaign that Western history tends to compress or skip past entirely. From the Sicily landings in July 1943 through the grinding advance up the Italian peninsula, American troops fought in terrain that heavily favored the defense. Mountains, river crossings, narrow valleys, prepared fortifications. The Garand performed in all of it. Rain, mud, the cold that thickens lubricants and stiffens mechanisms, the M1 kept functioning. Supply to units in Italy wasn't always consistent in the early months, and some American units weren't fully re-equipped until mid-1944. But the rifle's reputation among the soldiers who carried it was already established. On June 6, 1944, nearly 160,000 Allied soldiers crossed the English Channel in a single day, landing on 5 beaches along the Normandy coast of France. The Americans went ashore at Omaha and Utah. The British and Canadians took Gold, Sword, and Juno. The American infantrymen carried M1 Garands. Omaha Beach was the worst of the 5. German defensive positions on the bluffs above had clear fields of fire across the open sand. Landing craft had been pushed further offshore than planned by rough seas, and preliminary air and naval bombardment had failed to destroy most of the fortifications. Men were dying before they reached the waterline. One study estimated that at certain points along Omaha Beach, there were 32 incoming rounds per square foot every 10 seconds. But consider this. In that chaos, smoke, surf, noise, men falling in the shallows, the Americans who reached the seawall and who eventually moved off the beach had a rifle that could put sustained, accurate semi-automatic fire on a German position without any pause for bolt manipulation. That mattered, at the level of the individual soldier, on the day that mattered most. By the end of June 6th, the beachhead was secured at a cost of more than 4,000 American casualties on Omaha alone. The rifle had done what it could do, which was everything it was designed to do. Let your body settle a little more heavily where you're resting. These were not mythological figures being moved across a map. They were 20-year-old men from Iowa and Georgia and Pennsylvania and California carrying a 9.5-pound rifle and trying to do their jobs in conditions that were designed to kill them. The M1 Garand was not a heroic object. It was a tool, a better tool than what the other side was carrying. And across millions of small engagements over 6 years, that difference accumulated into something that altered the outcome. The campaign through the hedgerow country of Normandy that followed the D-Day landings was brutal in ways that the broad historical accounts sometimes flatten. The bocage, that dense network of ancient earthen banks topped with thick hedgerows, was nearly perfect defensive terrain. It reduced visibility to almost nothing, gave German defenders endless natural cover and ambush positions, and made American armor nearly useless in the enclosed lanes and fields. Artillery was hard to direct accurately. The fighting devolved repeatedly into small unit engagements at close range, where individual weapons determined what was possible. In that environment, the M1 Garand's rate of fire was not a marginal advantage. A German squad defending a hedgerow gap with K9 8K rifles could hold that position effectively as long as the opposing side had to pause to manually cycle the action between shots. When the opposing side could fire 8 rounds in 5 seconds without breaking aim, that dynamic shifted. Fire superiority in close terrain belongs to the faster weapon, and in Normandy in 1944, the faster weapon was the Garand. There is one dimension of the M1 Garand that receives less attention than it deserves: the sighting system. Most bolt-action rifles of the period, including the K9 8K, used a relatively simple rear notch paired with a front post, adequate for aimed fire at standard combat ranges, but limited in terms of adjustment. The M1 Garand's rear sight was an aperture design, a peep sight, with real and usable adjustments for both elevation and windage. The front sight was a blade protected by a hood. The sight radius, the distance between front and rear sight, measured 27.9 inches, which gave the shooter a more precise angular relationship between eye and target than shorter rifles could offer. This is not a minor point. American soldiers could actually zero their rifles to their specific ammunition and conditions, not just in peacetime training, but in the field, under the conditions they would fight in. And there is more to it than that. A rifle that shoots consistently where you aim it is worth more than one that is theoretically accurate but variable in practice. The M1 Garand was consistent, and because the soldier did not have to move his firing hand to cycle a bolt between shots, he could stay on target from round to round in a way that bolt-action users physically could not. Between September 1944 and February 1945, the M1 Garand faced two of its most demanding tests in the European theatre. The first was the Hurtgen Forest, a dense stretch of German woodland east of Aachen that American forces entered in September 1944 and did not fully clear until February 1945. The Hurtgen campaign is one of the less examined episodes of the American War in Europe, perhaps because it was costly and strategically ambiguous. The fighting took place in cold, wet, mud-soaked conditions where visibility was measured in yards, where artillery tree bursts sent shrapnel in every direction, and where trench foot and frostbite were as dangerous as the enemy. Rifles froze, mechanisms clogged with forest mud. The real test of any weapon in those conditions is not performance on a clean range in summer. It is whether the mechanism functions when it's packed with frozen dirt, when oil has thickened in sub-zero cold, when the hands operating it can barely feel the trigger. The M1 Garand passed that test, though not without requiring more maintenance than in temperate conditions. Veterans who fought in the Hurtgen consistently noted that the rifle demanded more attention to cleaning and lubrication in cold forest conditions, but that it continued to function reliably when that maintenance was provided. The second test was the Battle of the Bulge. On December 16, 1944, Germany launched its last major offensive in the West, a massive armored thrust through the Ardennes forest in Luxembourg and Belgium, aimed at splitting the Allied line and capturing the port of Antwerp. It achieved genuine surprise. It overwhelmed units unprepared for its scale. American soldiers retreated, surrendered, and died in the opening days. But American infantry units that held key road junctions, among them the 101st Airborne at Bastogne, held them through weeks of Belgian winter against repeated German assaults, with the M1 Garand as their primary individual weapon. German commanders who planned frontal attacks on dug-in American positions found repeatedly that the volume of American small arms fire, not only from machine guns but from the constant, accurate semi-automatic fire of individual riflemen, made those attacks prohibitively costly. The Bulge was contained and then reversed. By late January 1945, the last major German offensive in the West was finished. As you breathe and let the story wash gently over you, think about the distance those rifles traveled, From the beaches of Normandy east across France and Belgium and into Germany itself, American soldiers who came ashore on June 6th carried M1 Garands, or rifles exactly like them, across the Rhine in March 1945, through the ruined cities, past the liberated concentration camps, all the way to the German surrender in May. The rifle had been present for the entire distance, through hedgerows and frozen forests and rubbled streets, through rain and mud and the grinding monotony that sustained combat actually produces. It kept working. General Patton's assessment, the greatest battle implement ever devised, is most fully understood when considered against that entire arc. On the other side of the world, in the Pacific, the terrain and environment were entirely different, but the essential conclusion was the same. The Pacific War was fought across islands, some small, some large, some flat, some volcanic and mountainous, and at ranges that were often very short, where jungle reduced visibility to a few yards. Japanese infantry doctrine differed from German doctrine in many ways, but it shared the same foundational limitation. The standard Japanese service rifle, the Arisaka in its various configurations, was a bolt action, capable at longer ranges, well made, but slow. Japan was aware enough of the M1 Garand's advantage that they attempted to copy it. The Type 4 rifle, sometimes called the Type 5, was essentially a Japanese manufactured version of the M1, chambered in the Japanese 7.7mm cartridge with a 10-round fixed magazine loaded with stripper clips. Production began, but by the time the first Type 4 rifles were being assembled, Japan's industrial capacity was already collapsing under American naval and air power. Only about 250 were ever completed. None saw combat. The fact that Japan attempted the copy at all is itself a form of military acknowledgement that the opposing side had something worth replicating. The Marines who landed on Iwo Jima in February 1945 were among the most experienced small unit fighters in any army in any war. They had been through Guadalcanal, through the Central Pacific Campaign, through everything the Japanese military could put in front of them, and they carried M1 Garands. The fighting on Iwo Jima lasted 26 days, in volcanic ash and tunnel networks and fortifications specifically designed to resist the kind of assault the Marines were delivering. Military historians still discuss Iwo Jima as one of the most difficult combat environments any soldiers have faced. The Garand worked in that environment. On Okinawa, the last major island campaign before a planned invasion of the Japanese home islands could begin, American Army and Marine forces faced defenders who had adapted their tactics to trade ground for casualties, dug in deep, in a defense designed to exact maximum cost at every step. The M1 Garand was part of what allowed American forces to keep moving, not quickly, not cheaply, but moving. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 ended the war before the invasion of Japan was launched. Some historians estimate that a ground invasion would have cost millions of lives on both sides. Others dispute those figures. What is not in question is that millions of M1 Garands were stockpiled, zeroed, and ready. They were never needed. The war ended in September 1945. The world that came out of it was not the same world that had entered it, and the M1 Garand did not retire. It kept working. In June 1950, North Korean forces crossed the 38th parallel and invaded South Korea. American forces, much of their war-fighting capacity demobilized in the 5 years since 1945, scrambled to respond. They carried M1 Garands. The same rifle that had gone ashore at Normandy and through the Pacific jungles was now in the hills of the Korean peninsula, in temperatures that sometimes dropped to 40 degrees below zero, in terrain that was steep, exposed, and entirely unlike anything that American planners had been focused on. The M1 Garand performed in Korea. cold weather modifications were developed, including a winter trigger device that allowed the rifle to be fired while wearing heavy gloves. A practical adaptation because fingers that cannot feel a trigger guard are a serious tactical liability at 40 below. The Department of Defense placed new production contracts. International Harvester Corporation, the farm equipment manufacturer, adapted its industrial capacity and produced 337,623 M1 Garands between 1953 and 1956. Korea confirmed what the Second World War had established. The M1 Garand, designed in the 1930s and adopted in 1936, was still a relevant and effective infantry rifle 2 decades later. That kind of longevity in a service weapon is not common. On March 26, 1958, the M1 Garand was officially replaced as the US standard service rifle by the M14, a weapon that John Garand had himself helped develop, and which was essentially a refined M1 with a detachable 20-round magazine and selective fire capability. The M14 was not a departure from the Garand's design philosophy. It was a direct extension of it, tracing back to decisions Garand had been making in the Springfield Armory experimental shop in the 1920s. But there is more to the post-war story than replacement. Reserve and National Guard units continued to use the M1 Garand into the 1970s. Small numbers remained in service with some units in Vietnam in the early 1960s. And then there was the export chapter, which carries a particular irony that is worth noting clearly. After the war, the United States provided M1 Garands in large numbers to Allied nations whose armies needed re-equipping and whose budgets couldn't support new domestic production. South Korea, the Philippines, Greece, Turkey, Denmark, Italy, and West Germany and Japan. The countries that had been on the other side of the M1 Garand's barrel in 1944 and 1945 were rearmed in the 1950s with M1 Garands supplied by the United States. Soldiers of the new West German Bundeswehr trained with the same rifle that had helped defeat the Wehrmacht. German soldiers learned to load the Bloc clip, work the safety, and field strip the mechanism that their father's generation had faced across the hedgerows of Normandy. History does not always resolve cleanly. Sometimes it produces outcomes that are simply strange. And if you're willing to see them that way, quietly instructive. As the night deepens around you, stay with the rifle for a moment longer, because there is a dimension of the M1 Garand's story that the tactical analyses and production charts don't capture: the experience of carrying it. Veterans who carried the M1 Garand through the Second World War describe it consistently. Heavy is always first. 9.5 pounds is a real weight over miles of movement through water and mud and sand for weeks and months at a time. Not all of them loved it. Some would have traded it for something lighter without hesitation. The on-block clip limitation was a genuine tactical constraint. You could not easily top off a partial clip, which meant soldiers tended either to fire through all 8 rounds before reloading or carry on with fewer than 8 in the rifle. Some soldiers, before going into a situation where they might need every round, would deliberately fire off their remaining 2 or 3 rounds just to start with a full, fresh clip. But here is what most veterans consistently report. Despite the weight, despite the clip limitation, most of the men who carried the M1 Garand describe it with an uncomplicated attachment. It was their rifle. They could field strip it blindfolded. They knew how it sounded when it was clean and how it sounded when it needed attention. After months of carrying it, the rifle became an extension of the person carrying it, the way a craftsman's primary tool does. When Andrew Biggio, a Marine Corps veteran and author, began visiting America's last living World War II veterans in the 2000s, he brought with him a 1945 M1 Garand, not as a prop, but as a means of opening conversation. He found, repeatedly, that when he placed the rifle in the hands of a veteran who had carried one 70 years earlier, something opened. Memory became accessible. Men who had not spoken about the war in decades began to talk. The rifle, as a physical object with weight and familiar mechanism, reached something that words alone had not. 96 veterans signed that rifle before Biggio stopped counting. Spend a quiet moment with the man at the center of all of this. Not the generals, not the politicians, not the strategists. Just John Garand. By all accounts, he was genuinely modest, not as a performance, but as a basic feature of his personality. He did not seek recognition or cultivate a public profile. He worked, solved problems, moved on to the next one. A 1941 newspaper account described him as being of average build and average appearance, with what the reporter called the quiet shyness of the absorbed technician. He could walk through a room unnoticed. He gave his most consequential invention to the United States government without compensation, watched other men make money manufacturing it, and apparently did not dwell on that publicly. He received awards and medals and eventual Hall of Fame recognition, but not money. Congress attempted and failed to award him $100,000 in appreciation for work that had arguably changed the outcome of a world war. He kept designing anyway. He died on February 16, 1974, at 86. He had lived to see his rifle superseded by the M14, which he helped develop, and then watched the M14 give way to the M16, a rifle that fired a smaller cartridge, operated on a different mechanical principle, and represented a philosophical departure from everything the M1 Garand stood for. Whether that departure was an improvement is a question that serious people still debate. What is not a question is what John Garand's rifle was: heavy, reliable, accurate, and effective across the full range of conditions that 2 world wars and a regional conflict could produce. It did exactly what it was designed to do, from 1942 through 1953, in 2 oceans and on 3 continents. Now let's return to the German soldiers, the ones whose fear of this rifle became the organizing question of tonight's journey. By the summer of 1944, German infantry had spent years absorbing what American firepower actually felt like from the wrong end of it. There is a tendency, when analyzing tactical advantages in weapons, to reduce the human beings involved to abstract factors in an equation. Side A with capability X versus side B with capability Y at range Z. That kind of analysis is useful for understanding patterns, but it flattens the human reality. German soldiers who faced M1 Garand armed Americans were not simply overwhelmed by superior technology. They were experienced soldiers, many of them veterans of campaigns in Poland, France, the Balkans, North Africa, and Russia, who had developed sophisticated small unit tactics and the kind of battlefield instinct that only extended combat can produce. Against raw American units in 1942, that experience was often decisive. But experience is not the same thing as technology. Tenacity is not the same thing as rate of fire. A German rifleman lying behind a hedgerow, working his K98K bolt as smoothly and quickly as his training permitted, was still at a fundamental structural disadvantage against an American rifleman lying behind the opposite hedgerow with his finger on the trigger of an M1 Garand. All the training in the world cannot make a bolt-action mechanism fire as fast as a semi-automatic trigger. Experience can compensate through better positioning, better cover, better use of terrain, but it cannot close that specific gap. And in a direct exchange of fire between equivalent positions, the semi-automatic weapon wins. German after-action reports, memoirs, and post-war interviews with veterans all point to the same observation. The volume of American rifle fire was unexpected, and it required tactical responses that the Wehrmacht's existing doctrine had not anticipated. Germany's attempts to close the gap, the Gewehr 43, the Sturmgewehr 44, incremental increases in machine gun allocation, were never sufficient. The STG-44 was a genuinely innovative weapon, firing an intermediate cartridge from a 30-round magazine in selective fire, and it pointed toward the design philosophy that would dominate infantry weapons for the next century. But it arrived too late, was produced in insufficient numbers, and consumed industrial capacity that Germany was rapidly running out of. For most German soldiers, through most of the war, the rifle in their hands was still the Karabiner 98K, still a bolt action, still slower. Breathe slowly now. We're approaching the end of tonight's journey. The M1 Garand's history is, at its core, the history of a specific kind of advantage, not the overwhelming advantage of a weapon without weakness, but the more durable advantage of a better solution to a well-defined problem. The problem was, how do you give an ordinary soldier, with ordinary training and ordinary aptitude, the ability to deliver accurate fire more quickly than his opponent? John Garand found an answer to that problem by working patiently in a government workshop for 17 years on a government salary, without expectation of personal financial reward. That answer, implemented at industrial scale by hundreds of thousands of workers, including the women who ran the forges and lathes at Springfield while the men were fighting, reached every American infantryman who needed it. The Second World War was determined by many factors: production capacity, strategy, the extraordinary sacrifice of Soviet soldiers on the Eastern Front, the logistical scale of American supply lines, air power, naval power, intelligence, and decisions made at every level from the individual foxhole to the highest commands. The M1 Garand was one thread among many, but the threads are what the fabric is made of. And when you trace this particular thread back, you find a man at a workbench in the 1920s, thinking through gas pressures and bolt geometry and the tolerances required for mass production. Not dramatic. Not particularly visible from the outside. Just a man and a problem and 17 years of careful, patient work. The war ended in 1945. The M1 Garand was formally replaced in 1958. The last American combat unit to carry it stood down sometime in the 1970s, and yet the rifle has not disappeared. The Civilian Marksmanship Program, a federally chartered organization that promotes rifle marksmanship among American civilians, has sold hundreds of thousands of M1 Garands to the public over the decades. They are shot in competition, carried in ceremonial duties by honor guards, held in collections, and still maintained exactly as they were designed to be maintained. They still work. 8 rounds of .30-06, semi-automatic, 40 to 50 aimed shots per minute in trained hands, effective to 500 yards. The mechanical specifications haven't changed because the mechanical design was right the first time. Every year at Camp Perry in Ohio, there is an M1 Garand match, part of the national matches, the premier rifle competition in the United States. Competitors from across the country come to shoot the same rifle that American soldiers carried at Normandy. They fire at targets, they compare scores, they talk about the rifle's history and its mechanism. And when the last round is fired and the clip ejects, that clean, sharp, metallic ping, it is audible on the range, clear and distinctive in the quiet, with no artillery or machine guns to bury it. People smile when they hear it. It is, in that setting, simply the sound of something that worked. And so tonight, as you rest and the world grows still around you, consider the quiet threads that run through history, the ones that are only visible when you know where to look. A Canadian boy sweeping mill floors in Jewett City, Connecticut. A workbench in a government armory. 17 years of work on a problem most people would have abandoned after 5. A clip of 8 rounds and the mechanism to fire them without pause. A sound, clean and metallic, that echoed across the hedgerows of Normandy, the volcanic ash of Iwo Jima, and the frozen hills of Korea. History is not made only in the grand gestures and the famous photographs and the speeches that get recorded and quoted. It is made in workshops, in engineering drawings, in the willingness of people to keep working on hard problems long after the problem has stopped being interesting to anyone else. The rifle that German soldiers came to fear was not fearsome because it was invincible. It was feared because it was better. And it was better because one man, over 17 careful years, in a government workshop in Massachusetts, made it so. Rest now. The night is quiet. The world outside can wait. History is still being made, in workshops and laboratories and small rooms where someone is working on a problem they believe matters, and doing it without any particular expectation that anyone will notice. That kind of work has always mattered more than it looks like it does. Good night. Classified conflict. Deep history for quiet nights. For quiet nights. For quiet nights. For quiet nights. For quiet nights.